Hello there. Um, Trying out different video settings on my camera. This is the lowest quality. You don't need to see me that well. I'm not going to show you anything. I'm just a talking head. Instead of an audio podcast, I thought I would try a video podcast. Today's subject, or I should say, the subject for this particular podcast is Leroy K. Rogers of Iona, Florida, formerly. He's now deceased. He passed away in 2018. He has 3 patents to his credit. I first learned about him in 1980, and to my disgrace and shame, I chose not to get involved. I thought to myself, hey, he's got it in the bag. He doesn't need my help. Boy, I couldn't have been more wrong. I knew nothing about the history of free energy, and the kind of competition, fierce competition against it, even from the halls of government, because all we have to do is go to the testimony of Ralph Ring. There's his involvement with Otis T. Carr, C-A-R-R. There's a interview of him on YouTube. There's several, but the one that one in particular, I can't remember who gave him that interview. He talks about the raid. The FBI raid and a few other alphabet soup agencies showed up at their door, and they gave them a gag order, and that was the end of that. And it all stemmed originally from Otis T. Carr. As a young man or a teenager, had a job delivering birdseed, and he in New York in Manhattan, and he delivered to Tesla one day in Central Park, so that Tesla could feed the pigeons, because that's all Tesla could do at that point. And they started a fast friendship in which they would meet in the park and discuss. And Tesla told him, I'm a washout. Nobody will allow me to go commercial with any of my ideas. Maybe you'll have better success than me. And so Otis got his training from Tesla just by meeting with him. Tesla didn't have a lab at that point. He just had a hotel room and a box of paperwork. So he might have showed him some things, his blue notebook. In fact, yeah, Otis T. Carr acquired the blue notebook before it was stolen from him. This was a secret notebook of Nikola Tesla. Anyway, so Otis and Ralph Ring, they came up with some pretty heavy-duty stuff. I won't get into that because that's not the purpose of this podcast. Let's see, the purpose. What's the purpose? Oh yes, Leroy K. Rogers. So I have a certain amount of shame of not getting involved now that I know in hindsight what I know. But at the time, um, I haven't been able to make any kind of improvement since then because I have no new information to go on, or insight or training or whatever. So at the time, that was 45 years ago, I came to the conclusion this is how Leroy did his job, because there were a few hints. What he did was he started out, he had a station wagon, and he started out by removing everything he didn't need to run his internal combustion engine on compressed air, because he thought to himself, when we burn gasoline, that's all we're doing. We're creating this pressurized gas condition, and I could just as easily go rent some compressed air tanks, put it in the back of my station wagon, run a line to the front, remove everything that's not needed, such as the carburetor and the muffler and whatnot, and just feed compressed air to the engine. And I think his neighbor was a mechanic, so they worked together. He helped Leroy. In any case, this is how it started out, that Leroy drove around his car on rented or purchased tanks of compressed air. Eventually, he figured out how to compress the air, or how to deliver, maybe is a better way to put it, how to deliver compressed air to his engine in such a way that if he drove faster than 20 miles per hour, if he didn't go below 20 miles per hour, let's put it that way, he could always have enough air in his tanks because he took out the gas tank and he put in four smaller tanks. Three would fill while the fourth would drain, and he'd, you know, rotate them. So he was able to deliver compressed air fast enough that he could drive, provided he drove faster than 20 miles per hour. Now, otherwise the car would stall because he'd run out of air. Now, my guess is, notice if you got to think about this, see, but I didn't at the time, but now in hindsight, I can see what was lacking in my Sherlock abilities. By replacing his gas tank with four smaller tanks, don't you think they would have been in a liquid form? What was stored there? That's what goes in that tiny little space where the gas tank is anyway, is liquid gasoline. When you have compressed air, it takes up a lot of volume, and that's why it worked for him, because in the beginning, because he had a station wagon, so he had plenty of room to put down the back seat and lay out the gas tank in the back of his station wagon. They're big. They probably stand 4 feet tall. They're slender, but they're tall-ish. And but if you're going to put them in replacement tanks, four of them, a fourth, each one a quarter the size of the original gas tank. Duh, it better be liquid. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm hinting at what I'm getting to. At the time, 45 years ago, I figured out that, if he used a heat pump, such as a Stirling cycle heat pump, a heat exchange device, to take heat out of the air intake that his car was receiving, in order to chill air down to liquid air temperature, it would take very little energy to do that, and a lot easier than trying to compress the damn stuff. Then what you do is you use the decompression cycle of each piston in his engine to create a flash distillery. Because if you decompress liquid air in the right manner, all of a sudden the thing flash boils. In other words, it turns into vapor. And now you've got this instantaneous transition from a liquid state to a vapor state of air, exactly duplicating what would happen if you ignited gasoline, which is the same deal. And yet you get to reuse the air, reuse the energy of the forward motion of your car, the flywheel, the momentum of the car to liquefy more air fast enough to keep the whole thing going. So this is how I think he did it, but I don't know. In reading the patents, there's not the slightest clue that this is how he did it. In fact, the way his patent is written, it could be just a red herring. The whole patent may be a waste of time to even go there, to expect it to legally protect him. I don't know. Maybe it does somehow. Because I didn't find any correlation between his patent, the first one that he wrote. I don't think I bothered to read the second or the third one. But when I first learned that he did have a patent, it was only one at the time, and I read through it and I didn't see anything in there that would suggest what I think he did. And the reason why I came up with this scheme of mine, a speculation, based on one little factoid. At the time in 1980, I went to the back of like Popular Mechanics or something, Popular Science. That's how we did things back then. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have cell phones. So I sent away for a magazine on free energy, and he was one of the articles written up in that magazine. Tiny little thing. No glossy pages. It was all paper. Anything that... Anyway. So he had a lot of people just come to meet with him. He stirred up a lot of interest. Just like Joseph Newman stirred up a lot of interest. He did too. He had military show up, military brass. He had congressmen, all kinds of people. But no one helped him out. he went to each of the three automakers in Detroit. So that would be Ford, General Motors, and who's the other one? Well, shows you how much I know. And each of them individually turned him down. And he claimed, like Sangalani Chikumbutsu, Maxwell Sangalani, that this could have been done all along. That he didn't discover, Leroy K. Rogers did not discover anything new. He just did what could have been done for the past century, from the very beginning of the automobile industry. But nobody has done it. Why? Because they like to burn gasoline, I guess. So after he was turned down by each of the individual three automakers in Detroit, they pooled their resources and came back to him with a joint offer of $1 billion exclusive. In other words, he'd lose rights, and let alone nobody else would get any rights. And he was afraid they were going to shelve his technology, and that was the only reason why they were offering him $1 billion. Well, as we all know, Stanley Meyer took the bait, the $1 billion bait offer, and was poisoned. So nothing came of it. Poisoned at the meeting before anything was signed. So no billion was lost. How nice. Offer $1 billion, but don't expect to pay it. Well, Leroy must have had better karma because he has survived being poisoned, if that was indeed what was going to happen to him. And he decided, well, he'll sell kits. He can sell them for $1,000 for people to do it yourself, to install it with step-by-step instructions, how to install it themselves, how to take out what's not needed anymore. And you know what? I fully expected he'd become a household name, and he's not. You ever hear of Leroy K. Rogers of Iona, Florida? I've never heard of him outside of that magazine article. He's less popular than Stanley Meyer. So maybe because he wasn't poisoned to death. But there was one little factoid that serves my purposes for speculatory purposes, and that is this. It was reported by somebody on the scene, not by Leroy, that when his car was running, idling in the driveway, before it used up all its air, the engine block ran so cold to the touch that it developed a very thin layer of ice on the engine block itself. That told me there was an endothermic reaction taking place, which nowadays I know is commonplace for free energy devices in general to suck energy from their environment. Whether it's thermal, whether it's electrical, reactive, imaginary, doesn't matter. You name it, that's the stance that free energy circuits take. And it's a very reasonable guess estimate because it's predicated on another little factoid in which it is an exothermic situation when copper ore is smelted down to copper metal, in which, let's say it's copper sulfate. The sulfate ion is removed because we've heated the copper slag or copper ore to the point that it becomes copper slag, and then we remove the solid portions that float or sink, and we end up with pure copper metal. Now, the energy of a copper sulfate or a sodium chloride, any kind of binary compound, the energy, the electrical energy is in the negative compound, not the copper, not the sodium. They're deficient in energy. In fact, in the 1800s, they didn't say sodium chloride. They would call it chloride of sodium because the chloride is the yang, the sodium is the yin. The chloride or the copper sulfate of copper, the sulfate is the energy, the qian, the yang, three solid lines in the I Ching, while the three broken lines, kun, un, is the emptiness, the void, Nietzsche, the void, the emptiness. And that's what copper is. Copper, pure metal, is void of energy. And it's hungry for energy. It's not just void. It's not zero. It's negative. It's got a negative balance of deficit of energy because That's the way valence pairings of electrons go when you create a binary compound such as copper sulfate. Remove the sulfate, and now that plethora of energy or minor amount of energy is gone, and now you've got a minor deficit. So what the copper does is what humans do when they're poor. They link arm in arm together and they form a group, a collective, to share what little resources they have to survive their poverty. And this is what copper does. So copper is a conductive metal and very useful because it wants energy. It's hungry for energy. And thus, if we force feed it energy from a battery, let's say, it's going to accept it. It's going to, oh, wow, this is great, but it can't hold on to it because it's pure copper metal. So it must get rid of anything you give it. It can't hold on to any of it. And so that's why I say that, in a sense, the copper metal has all the energy it'll ever need to run, and all you're really doing is conveying information to the copper metal because it can't store the energy, so how can it pass it along? I mean, physics says, oh, it passes the energy along and doesn't hold on to it. I don't even think it receives it, because if it can't store it, it can't receive it. It's just simple logic. There's no way it can receive it if it cannot store it. It's like having your mouth stuffed full of food. So much so your mouth is open, but the food is flush with your lips, and somebody's trying to ram food into your mouth. They're not going to succeed because you've already got food in there. It's like that with copper. Except with the copper, the lips are shut. And so there's no receptivity for energy because the copper cannot store it. Yet it is deficient in it. So it causes it to bind together and is useful as a conductor of information, but it cannot absorb energy because it cannot store it. If you recall, it's the insulation medium, the dielectric medium in between the two plates of a capacitor that stores the energy. And so if you insulate the copper wire, that could store energy, but not the copper. The air surrounding the copper wire, that could store energy, but not the copper. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, what's passing down the wire? Well, as it turns out, a ripple wave, which is what's it called? Oh shit, poor of words, longitudinal, longitudinal, god damn, I can't remember my vernacular. Well, there's a certain word, starts with the letter T, and it has to do with a ripple wave. Anyway, so a ripple wave is at right angles to the direction of travel. It's like you do the Mexican wave at a soccer game. You know, everybody stands up and raises their hands and sits down and lowers their hands, and they do it in sequence, or dominoes falling in sequence. That's information that's being passed from domino to domino. That's not energy per se. The energy stays with the domino, so it doesn't go anywhere. It's the information that passes down the row of dominoes, and it's more poignant example when you do the Mexican wave in a stadium, because nobody touches anyone. They just look at the corner of their eye, and they make note of the fact, the timing, when to stand up, and how quickly to stand up and sit down, in order to keep the wave moving at the same pace that it's going, and to keep it moving at all. So this is the way I look at energy, so-called energy traveling down a wire, because it's a state of deficiency. On the one hand, it causes it to link together, to bind together, to become a copper wire. So it's not friable sand, copper sulfate sand anymore, pulverizable. Unless you do what Tesla did, and you subject it to so much frequency and or voltage that it vaporizes. The wire turns into copper fine dust. So, under these considerations, this is the way I look at free energy, that it's an endothermic situation, that it wants energy, but it can't hold on to it unless you're dealing with capacitors. then it can hold on to voltage. Conductors, sure, it'll maintain a magnetic field operating the equivalency of a flywheel momentarily, but that's where the energy is stored. Okay, so when you have, okay, maybe some energy goes down the wire. I don't know, because it gets translated into but does it? Or is it simply an organizing principle in which the energy of the wire, so-called energy of the wire, is organizing the ions of the air into a dipole situation in which they exhibit the properties of a magnetic field, because that's the way permanent magnets are created out of magnetizable iron or any other similar substance. The magnetism is already there in the iron, but the problem is the dipoles of the little granules of iron are all pointing in random directions, canceling each other out, so you can't use it. But if you heat up the iron so the granules can move and put a strong influence of magnetic field on that iron, all the little granules will reorient themselves, and then maintaining that magnetic field but dropping the temperature so that the iron solidifies with the dipoles all lined up, the magnetic dipoles of the granules of iron all lined up in the same orientation. Now you got yourself a permanent magnet. So it cost you energy to reorganize the granules of iron, but you did not put any energy into the iron. You put coherence into it, which is information, not energy. So you didn't change anything about the material properties of the iron. You changed its geometry of the granules. And it cost you energy to do that, but it you did not store that energy. You stored it, unless you call information a potential form of energy, which is really what electrical reactance amounts to: frequency, capacitance, inductance. That's all information. How many turns of wire you have in your coil, that's information. And it cannot be spent in the course of running your car. The coil doesn't become unwound. The capacitor doesn't change its geometry, its capacitance. It continues, the frequency doesn't change. These are potentialities that cannot be spent, and that's why I've always said that a free energy device clones free power. It does not create energy, because the power that's being created is not energy anyway. It's imaginary power, which is a fiction, an artistry of mathematics that does not exist, and yet can be converted into real power. But of course, there are those who would like to argue against me on that point. Regardless. So getting back to, okay, so I branched off of endothermic reactions. So this is the way I look at free energy devices. They're endothermic. They are looking to get energy from somewhere. Either they get it from their past by recycling it, or else they steal it from somewhere else in their environment, or harvest it, depending on how you want to interpret, well, where did they get the energy from? A man-made source, it's theft. Nature, it's harvesting. Or they get it from the ether, which is the field of imaginary numbers. And this is where the cloning takes place, in which capacitance gives you voltage, inductance gives you amperage, that are imaginary in character, so that when you combine the two in Watts, under Watts' law, you get negative watts. Because the imaginary, you can't spend it, but you can clone it. That's what I've seen. It sure is very suggestive that that's what I've seen happen time and time again over the last 9 years of simulation work, is that the capacitance is cloning imaginary voltage, the inductance is cloning imaginary current, and only because they cannot become saturated. So the capacitance is, let's see if I get this right, reflecting the voltage and refracting the current. Do I have that right? Or is it the other way around? Refracting the voltage, reflecting the current? I forgot. I worked it out in my head, the logic, but I've forgotten by now which way it works. It's splitting electricity and synchronizing it at the same time, so that it's 180 degrees separation between current and voltage. And when you get that occur under the auspices of capacitance, the inductance cannot saturate the coil. It refuses to saturate, so you can have an unlimited quantity of energy passing through the coil. But you have to have a coil working in conjunction with a capacitance, inductance working in conjunction with capacitance, in order to have this cloning procedure take place. Um, so this is what I think was happening in Leroy's case. And if this morning, the reason why I'm posting this, I've known this for years. The reason why I'm posting this to you now is because I got an epiphany this morning, thinking to myself, okay, you've this. What if he never succeeded? He said, "Oh, all I have to do is retool, re-gear it, and I'll be able to get it to run. The car won't stall if I travel slower than 20 miles per hour." What if he never succeeded? What if it's impossible to gear it any smaller? And I thought to myself this morning, well, why doesn't he just add more gas tanks? Nice, but that's not a solution, a long-term solution. Might work most of the time, but once in a while it won't be good enough. So what if he never found a solution? Maybe there is no solution in any practical sense. What does this mean? It means that his device is no different in one respect to Joseph Newman's device, in that you've got a motor that can only operate in the highest efficiency possible, always at the same rate of rotation and the same similarity, consistency of load, torque load, because that's what it sounds like. You can't have too much variation. And this is also a problem that John Worrell Keeley also had in his. He couldn't get investors because they wanted a commercializable product that could, uh, a variable demand of a load can be placed upon it. And that's not the way Keeley worked. Keeley incorporated his load into his device on this assumption that the load would never vary. It would always stay the same. And so all his investors walked away, and historians claimed that Keeley was a fraud, which he was not. He just didn't know. He just didn't know in advance what kind of demands these investors would be making on him that he could not satisfy. So his history is assuming, that Keeley was omniscient and knew in advance and went ahead anyway, and I doubt it. I think he was just, you know, when you get so close to your subject that you don't see the big picture, it's very easy to learn after the fact the hard way why it's not going to work out. So I had the epiphany this morning that the hybrid that the Toyota Prius was at the vanguard of, but now all kinds of companies are making hybrids, is the perfect situation because the motor has a consistent load because it's rotating an electric generator. It's not trying to drive the car forward to accelerate it up a hill or into traffic. Instead, the motor comes on whenever the batteries need to be recharged. And although the motor does have to speed up in order to reach optimum operating rotary speed, it's a consistent speed once it gets there. And it runs only as long as it needs to recharge the batteries, and then it turns off. So that would be the perfect situation to apply the Leroy K. Rogers methodology for powering a gasoline-oriented, internal combustion engine-oriented engine. Is one of these gas-fired electric generators, that you can buy and serve as a backup, or that are also used at rock concerts and any place where they need to have their own microgrid to power all the amps and the speakers and whatnot for the audience, and they can't tie into the grid to do it, so they have to generate their own power, or a hybrid motor vehicle, or an assembly line in industry, constant rate. So this would be a perfect situation for those situations. And I just gave you as much as I know, which is not knowing. It's more speculation than anything else. But I can't see why it wouldn't work, because what I learned about what little I knew, I learned long ago, back in 1980, about Stirling cycle heat pumps. They are so efficient at what they do. There was this table model offered for sale that if you hooked it up to a little electric motor and ran it in one direction, the tip would get hot. You could light your cigar. But if you ran it in the opposite direction, a thin stream of liquid air would fall off the tip onto your tabletop. And I thought to myself, that is really cool. That is very efficient. That is so cool. So that's how I think Leroy did his thing. As for the particulars, there are all kinds of details complicating, how to implement that generalized view. But that's my generalized view, and I think it would be an opportunity waiting to be harvested by anybody who wants to put it into motion, because it's a very simple procedure. Liquefaction of the air and flash distillation through a decompression cycle, uh, portion of the cycle of the internal combustion engine, when the piston is withdrawing and expanding the volume, but the pressure has to drop because you've closed the valves. And so now if you've already put the liquid air in there, and then you yank on using the momentum of your car, yank on the piston to increase the volume there of that space, that liquid air has to vaporize. If there's sufficient force, it'll be forced to flash boil and give you a kick to help the other pistons do that, create the vacuum. So it's once you get the engine running, you're running it to create these vacuums that suddenly vaporize, or by way of flash distillation, the liquid air, depending on which piston is in which cycle. So you're going to have to probably need a minimum number of pistons, and probably the more pistons you have is really where you get the gain in terms of, well, how slow can you drive before the thing stalls because it ran out of liquid air to run on. I think it's a question of how many pistons do you have, really. The more pistons you have, the better off you are, and then you can take the stall speed to a lower level and get away with it. So that's my best guess estimation of how Leroy did his thing. May he rest in peace, I hope. He died an unsatisfied inventor, but maybe somebody will pick up the tab and move on from where he left off. Who knows?